Hello, and welcome to Intelligent Pod, the show where we break down the science of thinking, learning, and living smarter, one fascinating conversation at a time. I'm your host, Sophie Lane, and today we're diving into a topic that might just revolutionize the way you approach learning, working, and maybe even teaching others: cognitive load theory, and how understanding it can help us optimize how we learn and teach. So whether you're a lifelong student, a parent, a teacher, or just someone who's curious about the brain, today's episode is for you. We'll unpack what cognitive load theory actually means. Look at how it affects everything, from classrooms to kitchens. Explore perspectives from psychology, neuroscience, and culture. And I'll leave you with some actionable strategies to make learning easier and more effective starting today. All right, let's get started. Let's start with the basics. What is cognitive load theory, or CLT for short? At its core, cognitive load theory is a psychological framework that explains how our minds process information, and crucially, what happens when we overload that system. Think of your brain like a computer. There's a hard drive for long-term storage, but there's also a limited amount of RAM, working memory, that handles whatever you're doing right now. If you open too many browser tabs, run a bunch of heavy programs, or try to stream a movie while you're editing photos, things start to slow down. Eventually, your computer freezes, crashes, or just can't keep up. Our brains work in a similar way. Working memory is the mental space we use to hold and manipulate information in the moment, like remembering a phone number long enough to dial it, or following a recipe as you cook. But that working memory is shockingly small. Classic studies suggest most adults can hold about 7 pieces of information at a time, give or take a tuple. That's not a lot. And when we try to cram in more, we hit what's called cognitive overload. Cognitive load theory was first developed in the 1980s by educational psychologist John Sweller. He argued that if we want people to learn effectively, we need to design lessons and experiences that fit within the limits of working memory. Otherwise, learning stalls, frustration mounts, and information just doesn't stick. Let's make this relatable. Have you ever tried to learn a new skill? Maybe coding, playing an instrument, or even assembling flat-pack furniture, while juggling instructions, diagrams, and a mess of parts. Maybe you ended up staring blankly at Stec 12, feeling like your brain was melting. That's cognitive overload in action. Or if you're a teacher or parent, you might have noticed that kids tune out when instructions get too long or lessons seem too complex. Again, that's cognitive load. It's not laziness or lack of motivation. It's just biology. Now, why does this matter? Well, research shows that cognitive overload doesn't just make learning harder in the moment. It also leads to worse retention and more mistakes. In fact, one study from 2002 by Chandler and Sweller found that students who learned with too much information on a single slide, think text, images, charts, all crammed together, remembered less than those who learned with simpler, well-organized slides. Sometimes, less is truly more. So, let's dig a little deeper. Cognitive load theory identifies 3 main types of load that together determine how hard your brain is working. 1. Intrinsic load. This is the complexity of the material itself. Some things are just harder to learn. Trigonometry is more complex than basic addition, for example. 2. Extraneous load. This is the unnecessary load added by the way information is presented. Poorly designed slides, confusing instructions, or irrelevant details all add extraneous load. 3. Germane load. This is the mental effort dedicated to actually learning, understanding, and integrating new information. It's the good kind of load, the part that leads to learning. The goal, according to CLT, is to manage intrinsic load, minimize extraneous load, and maximize germane load. In other words, don't make things harder than they need to be, and give your brain space to focus on what matters. Let's bring in a real-life anecdote. A few years ago, I decided to take a pottery class. The instructor, while clearly talented, would often jump between demonstrating techniques, telling stories, and handing out written instructions, sometimes all at once. I remember trying to watch her hands, listen to her talk about clay chemistry, and read the steps for scoring and slipping. By the end of the class, My mug had collapsed, and my brain felt about as solid as wet clay. What was happening? Too much extraneous load, too many sources of information competing for my attention. Compare that to a different experience. Learning to make sourdough bread from a friend. She'd walk me through one step at a time, let me practice, and only explain the why when I needed it. No multitasking, no overload. The result? Not only did my bread turn out better, but I actually remembered the process. So, let's explore the perspectives that help us understand cognitive load even better. First, from a psychological perspective, CLT lines up with what we know about working memory and attention. Psychologist George Miller's famous magical number 7 research in the 1950s showed that most people could only hold 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information in their short-term memory at once. More recent research suggests it might be even less, sometimes just 4 chunks of information, especially when the material is complex. This is why techniques like chunking are so powerful. When we group related info together, like breaking a phone number into 334 digits, or learning a dance as a series of moves instead of 20 individual steps, we free up working memory and make learning easier. From a neuroscience perspective, imaging studies show that when we try to process too much information at once, the brain's prefrontal cortex gets overwhelmed. That's the part responsible for decision-making, attention, and problem-solving. It's a bit like a traffic jam in your brain. The more cars, or bits of info, the slower everything moves, until nothing moves at all. Culturally, it's fascinating to see how different societies approach learning and the risk of overload. In some Eastern education systems, like Japan, lessons are designed to introduce concepts slowly, with lots of repetition and practice, before moving on to new material. In contrast, some Western classrooms pack as much information as possible into a short time, sometimes underestimating the limits of working memory. But we're starting to see a shift. More teachers are embracing micro-learning, spaced repetition, and other strategies rooted in CLT. Let's talk about an academic study that really drives this home. In 2016, researchers at the University of California found that medical students who learned anatomy with simplified diagrams, showing just the relevant parts, not every muscle and tendon, scored significantly higher on tests than those who learned from complex, detailed images. The takeaway? Reducing extraneous load helped students focus on what mattered and learn more effectively. Now, it's not just about school or formal learning. Cognitive load theory applies to everyday life, too. Have you ever tried to follow a new recipe while your kids are asking questions, the TV is on, and your phone is buzzing? Or tried to write an important email while a dozen browser tabs are open and Slack is pinging? That's cognitive overload. Our brains crave simplicity, order, and manageable doses of information. So, what does all this mean for you? How can you use cognitive load theory to make learning, teaching, and even working more effective and less stressful? Here are some actionable strategies you can try. 1. Chunk information. Break down complex ideas into smaller, meaningful chunks. If you're studying for an exam, don't try to memorize a chapter at once. Instead, focus on key themes or concepts, and group related facts together. 2. Limit multitasking. Our brains aren't built to handle multiple sources of information at once. When you're learning something new, turn off notifications, close extra tabs, and give yourself space to focus. 3. Simplify your materials. If you're a teacher, parent, or manager, strip away unnecessary details from your instructions or presentations. Use visuals wisely. Don't overload slides with text and images. Less is often more. 4. Use worked examples. Research shows that seeing step-by-step solutions, like worked math problems or sample essays, helps learners avoid overload and understand new concepts faster. 5. Practice retrieval and spacing. Instead of cramming, space out your learning and test yourself regularly. This taps into germane load, strengthening memory and understanding. 6. Teach others. Explaining a concept to someone else forces you to organize your thoughts and focus on the most important parts, reducing extraneous load and deepening your own learning. 7. Be patient with yourself. If learning feels overwhelming, it's not a personal failing. It's just your brain reaching its limits. Take breaks, revisit material, and remember, deep learning takes time. Let's recap what we've covered today. Cognitive load theory is a powerful framework for understanding how our minds process information. By recognizing the limits of working memory, we can design learning experiences at school, at work, or in daily life that are more effective, less frustrating, and more enjoyable. Whether you're teaching, learning, or just trying to keep up with life's demands, managing cognitive load is key. So here's my reflective thought for you. The next time you feel overwhelmed by information, remember, it's not a sign of weakness, but a natural signal from your brain. Honor those limits, simplify when you can, and trust that with the right strategies, you can learn and teach just about anything. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Intelligent Pod. If you found this helpful, I'd love for you to leave a review. Your feedback helps others discover the show. For detailed show notes and more resources on cognitive load theory, visit intelligentpod.com. And if you have thoughts, questions, or episode ideas, drop me a note at sophie@intelligentpod.com. I always love hearing from you. Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and remember, smarter thinking starts with understanding how your mind works. Take care.